this is sort of an introduction not only to what we're going to do with Mesoamerica, but I want to lay some foundations so that we know kind of what we want to talk about and how all of these pieces are going to fit together. So there's a couple of things I'm going to be doing, and we start off with just kind of understanding what the problem is going to be. Now what I have to do is get, there we go. Now it's responding. Okay. So what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to puzzle out the Book of Mormon. We don't have any prophetic dictation that tells us where it took place. We know in the Old World we're linked to Jerusalem. And so we've got some information about the Old World. We get over to the New World and all of a sudden we don't have anything that's firm. But we can puzzle it out. And what I want to do is talk about sort of this process of how we puzzle this thing out. And I really liked actually this concept, and it took me a while to find somebody who was doing a puzzle this way, but I'm sure everybody's put a jigsaw puzzle together. And you know that what you try to do first is you try to put this border together, because what you want is the framework. You want to know kind of where the limits are of what you're going to be talking about. But after you have a framework, the next thing you start doing is with small pieces that start looking like they go together, and you make clusters, and then you'll find another cluster somewhere. And for those of us using a jigsaw puzzle, you've got a picture and you know what you're going to look at. Sometimes when we're dealing with the Book of Mormon, we're not really sure what we're going to be looking at. We know what the Book of Mormon says, but we don't know how it's going to fit. And so the pieces gather sometimes slowly, and sometimes they coalesce, and sometimes they're farther apart. But the more that they coalesce, the better our understanding is going to be. And what I want to do is, again, lay that foundation. So there's two important frames that we want to understand for how we deal with the Book of Mormon. And one of them is just ancient texts. We need to know something about how ancient texts work. And just to lay the barest of frameworks on this, in an ancient text, it's written by people who already know their culture. They already know their history. They know things that they don't put into their text because they already know them. And so it's not that important, because everybody that they expect to read this text is going to have the same background, and they're going to know the same kinds of things. It's somewhat similar to if I were to say to someone, it took me, I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It took me 10 hours to get to Salt Lake. What have I told you? Well, I've told you 10 hours. What do you know? Well, you're pretty sure I'm not walking. You're pretty sure I'm not flying, although in some of the circuitous routes that might have happened. But you're pretty sure I drove. I did not say that. I don't have to say that, because there's an understanding that we have. And that concept of how an ancient text works is really important, because what it means is that we have to read it carefully and start to look for connections to culture that may or may not be explicit in the text, but once we see them, we can recognize them. So that's the first framework. Second framework, geography. Well, that's kind of important. Dan Peterson talked about this in his presentation, where you look at the Old World, and based on geography, he talked about Laodicea and how that will inform the text. Well, we really, really, really want that for the Book of Mormon. We have it pretty firmly in the Old World. In the New World, we want something. Now, talking about the ancient textual frame, why does this make a difference? Well, what we're trying to do is to get an idea of culture that goes behind things. And in order to give you an idea, what I want to do is look at two scriptures that we get out of the New Testament, that if we have a cultural understanding and a cultural background, we get more out of the text. So this one is Matthew 5:38-40. I've put 3 verses here, and I'm really only interested in the middle one, but I want you to have some context. You heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that you resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if a man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. Okay, so these second 2 verses are going with the first one. It says, you've said an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Well, what is the context? The context is revenge. The context is you did this to me, I'm going to do that to you. And he's saying, okay, there's something different going on. It's the middle one. We always talk about turning in the other cheek. And any time I've heard that, usually in Sunday school lessons, it talks about us being, meek and lowly and essentially weak, because it's sort of like, you go ahead, beat me up. I'll take it, whatever you want to do. I want you to look at the picture. That picture is there, and actually I pulled this picture off of the internet when I looked for turn the other cheek, and I got this one, and it's wrong. Notice what the verse says. It says, whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, and look what's happening in the picture. It's not the right cheek, it's the left cheek. How is that right-handed person going to strike someone on their right cheek? And I submit to you that this is important information, because that's a backhanded slap and that's an insult. You may be slapping someone this way and trying to insult them, but at least it's peer-to-peer. This is to an inferior. And if you turn the other cheek, you're saying, yeah, treat me, I've got to take it. I can't fight back. This is the Roman world. And by the way, you've got swords and soldiers. I can't fight back. But treat me as an equal, as a human being, and not as, a dog or a child or anything that they would think is lower. Okay, another one. A little more complicated in this case. The light of the body is the eye. If therefore thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. But if thy eye be evil, thy whole body shall be full of darkness. And I remember going to my Greek professor when I was at BYU, and I said, what does this mean? What do you have an eye single to the glory of God? What is an eye single? And he said it was unmixed. And in this case, I'm looking up some of the words in this particular one, and slightly different, but still important. Start off at the beginning. It isn't light, it's lamp. And lamp is really important here because it's a source of light. We know enough about biology that we know that we see because light enters the eye. The critical part is in that part of the Mediterranean, they actually thought that the light was emitted from the eye and that there was a lamp or a source of light in you that extends out. So if your eye is single, plain, simple, your whole body can be full of light. There's nothing impeding the light inside of you. But if your eye, and of course now they're linking the lamp and the eye because those two are the same thing, be evil, and in this case it's a sorry plight, it's useless. This goes back to when a professor said, mixed. If it's not a good light, if it's not firm, if it flickers, if there's impurity in the wick and the oil, then it can flash and flicker, and frankly at times perhaps not even light. And so then the whole body becomes full of darkness because the lamp won't work. It's inefficient. So we start off with something where we can read it and we can make up all kinds of English ways to think about it. Our modern senses might understand that. But if we have a cultural context, we can go, oh, there is a wider expansive meaning to that than what I had originally thought. So that's the ancient frame, and that framework of thinking of a text as the Book of Mormon as an ancient text is one of the things that we need to do as we start to line it up with Mesoamerica. And I'll have a particular example of that as we go through. Okay, so now we're on to the geographic frame. Location matters. As you can see, we've got a pretty large hemisphere here, and one of the things that many geographers, Book of Mormon scholars have noticed is that if you take what we have in the Book of Mormon and you take the time that it takes for someone to go from one place to the other, you just cannot get from South America to the top of North America. You cannot get from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States. And for example, in the Book of Mormon, we have events that take place in the same war on the East Sea and on the West Sea. And there's some communication going back and forth. There's just no way you're going to do that by foot across the entire United States. It doesn't work. So location matters. And obviously, I'm not going to argue specifically for why Mesoamerica is the place. We're going to start with that. But starting with that framework now, we want to lay onto that framework information from the Book of Mormon to say, how well does the Book of Mormon fit when we start to lay that book, that text, that information on top of that geographic frame? So when we do this, if we set the Book of Mormon against a real world location and the real world time frame, so this is also important. We can't say, I found some things in Mesoamerica that look wonderfully Book of Mormon, and they come from AD 1400. Well, I'm going to have to make a really good argument because the Book of Mormon had been gone for about 1,000 years by then. Now, there are some things that we have a principle called upstreaming, where particularly in traditional societies, they don't change nearly as fast as we do. And so it is not unusual that we will take a little bit later information and try to push it back, as long as we don't find any reason that that would not have worked. So there is some of that, but again, time frame matters. So that's important. And when we fit the Book of Mormon there against that location, it should be a reasonable fit. We should find, for example, people there during Jaredite times. We should find people there during Nephite times. All of those things have to happen. What's more, it should be productive. Now, let me explain what I mean by productive. In the Book of Mormon, we can read the Book of Mormon completely devoid of history, completely devoid of geography. We can read it and it can enrich our lives and it can change our beings. But it can do more if, as we do with the Bible, we can put it against a cultural background. Productive means that not only do we start finding things where we can say, okay, this looks like it could have happened in the Book of Mormon, but then that context starts to explain the Book of Mormon in richer ways than we would have been able to explain it without that context. Remember, going back to turn the other cheek and to the I signal. So we want that for the Book of Mormon. We want that cultural context to enrich our experience. So now let's talk about that problem. Okay, what do you see? Because I don't get to see everybody raising hands or not, I've got to tell you what has happened when I've done this in a group, and about a group talking to 200 or 300 people. And I said, okay, now what do you see? And I said, how many of you see a dog? And about half of the people would raise their hands and say, yes, I see the dog. The other half are going, I don't see a dog. I have no idea what's going on. I see a bunch of dogs. I don't see a dog. Now, if perhaps you are one of the people who had not seen the dog's head is down here, left front paw, right rear paw. This is the Dalmatian, of course. Tail is up here. There's the back curving down and a collar. There's the dog. I have had it so that I've shown that to people and I still don't see it. But for the vast majority of people, once you have seen the dog, you can't unsee the dog. It's there. Every time you see this picture from now on, you're going to see a dog. But what is important and critical about that, going back to the pieces, if I looked at, let me go back up here, any dot that's out there, if I pick this and I said to you, that is part of the Book of Mormon, because those pieces fit into this larger context, it would be very easy for someone to say, well, that doesn't prove the Book of Mormon. And they would be absolutely right, because it doesn't. Not that one little thing. Not any individual spot will tell us what the whole picture is. What it does is say, this is a conclusive piece, and it fits into the framework in appropriate places and inappropriate locations and time frames. So what we need are multiple spots. We have to have more and more things that start to converge all on the right times and places. So now that we know what we're looking for, let's kind of take a trip into the Book of Mormon to see how the Book of Mormon not only matches up with, but in at least this first case, how it's going to answer a problem that we have with the Book of Mormon for Mesoamericanists. Here's the problem of orientation. For those of us who believe that the Book of Mormon took place in Mesoamerica, this is the general idea of where peoples would have been. So the Olmec are up in this region, the Maya down here, and then later in their existence, they start moving up into the Baten. But it's pretty obvious that this is north and that's south. And if I've got to find a West Sea, to us, this looks like a South Sea. To us, this looks like a North Sea. The problem is it's not supposed to be that way. We're supposed to have a narrow neck, and on the other side of the narrow neck are the East and the West Sea, and this one looks like the North. We've got a problem of orientation, and this is one where people have said about the Book of Mormon with a Mesoamerican perspective, can't be true, directions are all wrong. So what do we do? Well, remember that the Book of Mormon is an ancient text, and it's not necessarily behaving the way we think it should. What happens if we put that ancient text into this context and then ask questions about directions? Okay, what do we get? Well, what we get is the Mesoamerican conception of a direction that splits up the world differently than we expect. What we expect is the one that we just saw in this previous up here, this compass rose, where we've got the vertical north and the east and west. And what they did is they split them. And this whole triangle here is north. This whole triangle is east. That is west. And the conception wasn't the line, it was the wedge. Well, why was that? Well, they built all of their directions. If you look at the languages that are spoken in this area, not just Maya, but the other languages as well. If you look at their directions are based on the path of the sun, going from the east to the west. And the direction for north in many of them is on the right-hand side. And on for the west, it's on the left. And that is for the people who will put their back to the sun and say, okay, well, where's north on my right-hand side? Because my back's to the sun. In the other ones, north is left because they faced the sun. But conceptually, it's exactly the same thing. They're basing it on that east-west direction. Now, why does it tilt? Well, because the sun moves. I happen to have an office where my window faces east. And it's real easy for me to see in different areas, time periods of the year, that the sun is rising in a different location. Sometimes it's in my eyes, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's on the left, sometimes we're on the right. But the sun takes a path, and they took that into account. But the direction was always north, being to the right-hand side or the left of wherever the sun is right now. And that means you have a range. That means as the sun moves, you get a range. Now, the next thing that's important about the Book of Mormon is you have to remember that the Book of Mormon was written in an ancient time when you really didn't move around, and no one had these pictures, from airplanes that have the geographic perspective of everything. So they wrote from the perspective of the ground. They never could stand back and see the map like we're looking at it. Well, that means that when they give you directions, it's really anchored to the spot where they're looking. Well, many of our directions are anchored based on what's happening in the city of Nephi, which is down in the land of Nephi. And when it's down there, we get a narrow neck of land that runs from the east to the west. We get an East Sea. Does all that fit? Sure. Fits no problem. Then what happens is everybody moves up to Bountiful. And when you move up to Bountiful, east and west are in different places. There's an East Sea over here. Because, well, for two reasons. One of them, you've moved up to Bountiful, and now there's part of the sea that's in the east. But the second is, as you can see, what we would call north, they would say, okay, it's going to range through east to north to west. Why would they select one of those? Well, the East Sea is where the sun rises. The East Sea is the land of beginnings. If you're going to choose a name, you're going to choose east. That's just the way those cultures would work. And so when you put the Book of Mormon into that context and you say, well, what would the directions be if I were a Mesoamerican person? This is probably how they would shake out. John Clark looked at this and he said, here is the worldview. This is what they think the world looked like. And this is obviously based after they got to Zarahemla. But it says, okay, Zarahemla is, here, but what's around it conceptually? And conceptually, it's the center of a very ordered universe. And if you see maps from ancient Mesoamerica that the ancient peoples wrote, if you look at their maps, they don't look like maps that we expect. They'll have a few mountains here or there, but they're not trying to represent the reality like we are. They're representing a sacred reality. And they're saying, here's where the sacred mountains are, and here's where these relations are. Now, the other reason that I wanted to mention that is just because a lot of times people will work very hard to find a North Sea, a South Sea, a West, where we have to have 4 seas and you go count them. How do you know what the text really says? Well, you have to go to the text and ask it, and then look at what the text actually says happening. Every time we see North and South Sea, it is always in the context of the entire world. This map, this little thing, that whole conceptual unit. That's the only time we see North and South Sea. On the East Sea and the West Sea, we have actions that take place, battles take place, cities are built, cities are conquered, things happen on the West, things happen on the East. Nothing ever happens at the North Sea. Nothing ever happens at the South Sea. Those seas are there because it's a conceptual universe and you have to have them. But again, that puts it into the cultural context of the time and the place, and away from our expectations that we will impute to the text. Now, the next thing that I think is fascinating is when you start looking at directions, you get directions in the Book of Mormon that actually look like they kind of know about this east to west primary difference, because you will get things happening from the east to west. And as you start looking at directions, the primary directions are east to west. And then, of course, there is north and south. Everybody knows there is. But the essential ones and the ones that they will highlight are going to go east to west. Okay, so there's putting it down into culture. Now, what happens then when the geography becomes productive? When the geography can say, explain to me something. And here's the test. We have a problem in the Book of Mormon because down here in the land of Nephi, Limhi's people went from Zarahemla, they went down to the land of Nephi and they said, okay, we want to start a city down here. They went to the Nephites. They said, can we have a city? Sure, you can have a city. And then all kinds of things happen and they get conquered and they're really unhappy about that. They're going, oh man, if I can only get back and make connection with people of Nephi who are now in Zarahemla, those people could come and rescue us and it would be a great thing. And so they send off a search party to find Zarahemla. Now, this is only like maybe 2 generations after they originally came down from Zarahemla. So they would go to the old person, the old grandfathers and the grandmothers, and they said, well, you did this. How do we find Zarahemla? Well, you go up into the mountains. There's a narrow strip of wilderness and mountains that are going through here. Go up into the mountains, find the river, and then just trace the river. And once you've got the Sidon River, just follow the river, and Zarahemla's along the river. You can't miss it. And they missed it. How do you do that? Well, geography tells us. Just so happens that in a very small range of distance here, somewhere around 10 miles or so, 2 different rivers kind of have their headwaters up in the Cuchumatanes mountains. One is going to the left, the Grijalva, and the other is the Usumacinta. For those of us who follow John Sorensen's correlation on things, and Blake is one who would do that, this Grijalva is probably the Sidon. So instead of that, they went this way. Well, there's no Zarahemla on that river. There's lots of other places, but there's no Zarahemla. If you keep going and you don't find Zarahemla, what do you find? Well, a land of many waters, and up in through this entire region is where the Jaredites were, the Olmec were, and the Olmec and the Jaredites share time frames. I need to, again, as some others have, make sure I say that Jaredites are not Olmec, Olmec are not Jaredites. They're around at the same time and in the same place. And the Olmec probably shared in Olmec culture in very much the same way that Latter-day Saints in the United States share a general US culture. We are Latter-day Saints, but the car I drive and the house I live in don't look uniquely Latter-day Saint. They look like the rest of the culture. Okay, so geography, if we're in the right place, all of a sudden explains a story that otherwise wouldn't have no good explanation. All right, next one. We have a problem, another problem. This one's a little bit earlier than the last one. This one's Mosiah, who is down here in the city of Nephi, in the land of Nephi. Here are the mountains, and we're going to go up into the mountains, and we're going to end up along the Sidon, and he's going to flee armies, or Lamanite invasion down here. He flees, and he ends up in Zarahemla. And when he ends up in Zarahemla, he finds people that later are explained to be the Mulekites. And there are two things about them that are really important. And the first is they've lost their God, and the second is they've lost their language. Now, think about that for a second. I don't know how many of you are linguists, but if you know too much about linguistics, 400 years is about the time period that they've been in the New World, both the Mulekites and the Nephites, so ballpark of 400 years. They both came from Jerusalem. They both would have spoken Aramaic, Hebrew, whatever they're going to be speaking that same area of the world. They should have had the same language. And it should have changed because they weren't in contact with each other. But 400 years is not necessarily enough to be completely mutually unintelligible. We have words that differ from those English speakers in England. If we're trying to describe things on our automobile, hoods and bonnets and boots and trunks, and they're not the same vocabulary, but we could still figure it out. That's not mutually unintelligible, as though you were an English speaker and someone were speaking Quiche to you. You'd go, no clue, no idea. Okay. Yeah. But that's what they explain. And how does that happen? It should not happen that fast. And it says it's because they don't have books, but this is a time period people can't read that much anyway. Most of the population in Jerusalem is not literate. So having the book is not necessarily the only thing that's going to slow down language change. So why? Well, here's what's important. When we talk about Mosiah, he's one of the Nephites, and they will land on the west coast, probably down in this region somewhere, up into the highland Guatemala Valley, and we'll be looking at Caminaljuyu as a representative of locations in the right time and the right place in that Guatemala Valley. So that's where they are. And then they get kicked out and they have to come up here. So their path is starting in the west, coming up and moving into the Zarahemla River and going downstream to find Zarahemla. The people of Zarahemla are Mulekites. They would have landed somewhere up here. Well, if you remember, I said this is Olmec, and then later on Epi-Olmec, or the ends of the Olmec period. When you come in down here, you find Maya. And so it's highly likely that the Nephites eventually ended up speaking a Maya language. If you land up here, you're going to land in a place where they were speaking Soke. Soke is a completely different language, not related at all. And if you land up here and you're there for any length of time, you end up speaking Soke. And then it says they moved down the river, so they went upstream to get to Zarahemla. And it's entirely possible that the very first person that's founding this thing is Zarahemla, because it's named Zarahemla, and they tended to name things for the person who founded the city. So Zarahemla may not have been around for very long. But what's important is that creates an interesting situation. According to the Book of Mormon, you have Mulekites who come to Zarahemla from somewhere else, and the Book of Mormon will tell us they have lots of ties back into the Nephi or the Jaredite territory. You'll remember that Coriantumr finds them, which is a tie to the Jaredites. And they speak Soke, and then they're met by somebody else. So all of a sudden, why have they lost their language? They spoke a different language because of the different people that they found. You come together right at that place and you've got two different languages. If they have lost their religion because they adopted the religion of the people that was there, that explains what was happening and will explain a lot about the rest of the text of the Book of Mormon. And actually, I was going to zoom in on that one rather than talk on the other map. So this one you can see the area just zoomed in a little bit more, where the people up in here are going to come upriver, and these people are coming this direction. We do have archaeological evidence that there are elements of Maya pottery that are available and indicating some at least trade between the Zarahemla region, this valley, and the Maya in the Highland Guatemala Valley. All right. This has gone faster than I expected, but that's all right. Here's one that I think is fascinating because it answers a question that often we just don't answer, or we just don't ask the question. We know that the Book of Mormon ends. Very clear that it ends. You've got people dying off in Cumorah, and we know that Moroni is the last one, and he's wandering. He's got the plates, and he's got to get them to Joseph, and it's terrible. And we have the demise of the Nephites. So it's one thing to say that the Nephites died out, or in this case, were exterminated. It's another thing to say, well, why, after 1,000 years of beating back the Lamanites, why at this point in their history did the Lamanites finally conquer them when they could not do it for 1,000 years? Well, there has to be something. Something had to have changed. There's got to be something going on. And one of the things that Mormon does, and I've been tracing a lot of the things that Mormon does as he builds his text, and he does some very, very interesting things with foreshadowing and letting us know things that we ought to know about how this whole thing played out. Mormon is a wonderful writer who crafts history to tell a sacred story. Now, I'm not saying he makes up history. Historians don't do that. He's a good historian. I don't think he tells us a history that didn't happen. I think there's a lot of history that happened that he doesn't tell us because he doesn't care. It isn't relevant. But when he selects it, he not only selects it, but makes sure he selects stories that point to the story that he wants to tell. And one of the things that Mormon does a lot is let people know that the land northward is dangerous. We learn about that with Limhi when the people come back with the plates of ether. They learn about the Jaredites. They have seen a land where there are bones and destroyed cities. Mormon will name that land northward desolation. And you hear desolation, you go, oh man, yeah, that's really bad. That's really bad. And then he says, oh yeah, and up in this land northward, desolation, but not at the moment. Up in that land north, there's so many people, you wouldn't believe how many people there. There's so many people, they cut down all the trees and they're making cities out of cement. So here's Mormon who's saying this is desolate, but there's all these people. Well, that's because desolation is related to destruction. And he wants you to know that destruction comes from that point. We get a very small story that he put in for probably a very interesting reason. We have Morianton, where the city of Morianton and the city of Lehi, I think it's Lehi, are in conflict on the eastern border up near the narrow neck of land, just a bit south of Bountiful. And they're having a problem, and Morianton does some terrible things, and the other people say, okay, well, let's go get Captain Moroni to come and kick him out. And one of the things that Morianton does is, okay, well, I'm leaving. Every other time you have somebody who's leaving and is going to defect from the Nephites, they go to the land southward, to the land of Nephi. They go to the Lamanites. You never hear of a Lamanite in the north. Okay, these guys are going north. And Moroni says, oh man, we got to stop them, because if they get talking to those people in the north, that will be really, really bad. And so the story ends, but he never tells us why it's really, really bad if they go north, except there's a whole bunch of people up there, and Mormon keeps pointing to it. He has Nephi and Lehi, two brothers who are wonderful prophets, wonderful men, and they go to the land of the Lamanites and they convert a lot of people. From that converted group of Lamanites, we will get Samuel the Lamanite. So that's how good they were. Those two guys who were so good that they could convince the Lamanites went to the land northward. And what happened? Failed miserably. And Mormon wants you to know that. And so he brings them down. He doesn't tell the story. He just sends them up there and brings them back, because he wants you to know that it's bad. Okay, we go back to the real world now. I am convinced, and I will try really hard to convince you, that he's referring to Teotihuacan. And we'll end up in Teotihuacan, and we'll see that. Teotihuacan is the major power. This is the Rome of the period. These guys are dominant, and they are coming for anybody in their way. They are known as warriors. They have a fame of warriors. I am convinced that when Mormon begins to use the word Gadianton, he generalizes it and starts pointing it up there and saying, yeah, those guys up there, Gadiantons. Gadiantons, they're up there. And he says, remember, the Gadiantons are the ones that are going to destroy the Nephites, not the Lamanites. He never says the Lamanites are going to destroy them. It's the Gadiantons. Boy, those Gadiantons, they're going to be the end of us. And he's pointing, I believe, to Teotihuacan. Now, back to the question, why at this point? Well, in the square here, or the rectangle, excuse me, we have now at this final period, we have Nephites that are no longer in the land southward. They are concentrated on the land northward, just above, just north of. So I kind of fudged with my box there, but just north of the narrow neck of land. And they're in that region. And that's where they are. And that's where all of the Nephites have become concentrated. Now, you need to see the next map. This is a map of the trade routes. Now, if you will look, there is a trade route up here in the north, but if you are, conscious of what you're looking at, that's a sea route. You've got to go by boat to get through here. And they did. This is a legitimate route. They did have people who went there. But if you're coming on foot and you want to trade from, let's say, Teotihuacan, which, as you will remember, is sort of off to the northwest on our map here, how are you going to get to Guatemala? Or, let's see, it doesn't, Palenque, we're going to Palenque. Tikal is down in here. Tikal is the one that's really important for this one. If you want to get into Tikal and you're up in Teotihuacan, you're going to come down here and come along this road, because that's the way that you're going to get into Tikal. This becomes important because we have a stela that we can translate that says, in AD 378, Teotihuacan made an entrada into Tikal. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means they conquered them. They came in, they conquered. And then from that time period, we see Teotihuacan taking over multiple cities in the area. We see the architecture changing. We can see in statues of the warriors, we can see that they're wearing the war costumes of people from Teotihuacan rather than just the Maya. And then go back, AD 378. That should ring a bell. The next thing is, here's the location of the Nephites. There's the trade route. Guess who is sitting in a right spot to throttle trade between two major cities, one of whom was known to be the biggest, baddest guys of the time? A war of extinction is incredibly expensive. The reason why Lamanites had never exterminated the Nephites in the years past is because it's a very expensive, difficult thing to do. And it just costs a lot to do it. So what most wars were in Mesoamerica were wars to create tribute. They say, okay, I've conquered you. That's fine. I don't want to get rid of you. I'm just going to conquer you. You owe me money now. Basically, taxes. But taxes in goods. It was tribute. It was goods that would be sent over. And so they didn't really want to kill anybody off because the economics of the situation was, hey, once you are under my thumb, now give me stuff. And you remember what happened with Limhi and the Lamanites in his area. He had to pay them tribute, taxes, because he was under their thumb. And so he had to pay. Well, that's what they wanted. They didn't want to exterminate because it was not economic to do so. But if you've got somebody who's sitting on your trade route, now there's a good economic reason to say, okay, get out of my way. And now you have a very powerful city from the south, Lamanites, and you have a very powerful city from the north, Gadiantans, who come together. And what happens in the descriptions in the Book of Mormon, in Mormon's book, in the Book of Mormon, the very first thing that happens is there's a war and they defeat the Lamanites and the Lamanites go away. And the next thing they said, and the next time, Gadiantans show up. And what do the Nephites do? They turn around and run away. They've been winning for 1,000 years. Gadiantans show up, boom, they leave. And from that point on, from that point when the Gadiantans come in, although there are going to be little tiny victories along the way, the Nephites are lost. They're gone. Now, historically, in this place at that time period, we can point to exactly those conditions that would have created what we see at the end of the Book of Mormon. I think that's powerful. All right, last one. Once we start to have the frame and we've filled in enough pieces that it says, I got the overall picture. This whole picture is now coming together. Then there's some other pieces that will start to make sense that in and of themselves, just like looking at the spot on the dog, that one spot would not be very convincing. But once it's in that context as a secondary piece, as something that says, now that I see this picture, this one now starts to make sense. That's what we get. And I'll give you one, and then we'll save a bunch of them because we ought to have plenty of time to talk about this when we're together on the tour. Alma 31 and 10. This is a strange verse that we just kind of read over the way we do most verses in the Book of Mormon. Sort of like, yeah, it's there. That's what it says. But slow down. For it is expedient that there should be a great and last sacrifice, yea, not a sacrifice of man, neither of beast, neither of any manner of fowl, for it shall not be a human sacrifice, but it must be an infinite and eternal sacrifice. And we go, oh yeah, they're talking about Christ, and we go on. Okay, background. This is Alma preaching to the people who have been ostracized, kicked out of the religious functions in Antionum, the city of the Zoramites. We find that they have already begun to bow down to other gods. And so that kind of means in the Book of Mormon that they've stopped with the law of Moses. And so, whatever they might have listed with the law of Moses, they probably don't do that anymore. But they still know something about sacrifice. If we put this text in the context of the Book of Mormon, then we have to read it again and we have to say, okay, well, yeah, no manner of fowl, no manner of beast. Well, okay, those are in the law of Moses. But wait a minute, what's this no sacrifice of man, not a human sacrifice? What? None of those things are in the law of Moses. That's not even a consideration for the law of Moses. Why in the world would you bring up, oh, by the way, you shouldn't have a human sacrifice? Because everybody around them was doing it. Now, there are human sacrifices. We've heard about the ones from the Aztecs, and the Maya would do the same thing, where there'd be somebody who would have their heart cut out and the heart would be offered to the god. But that isn't the only thing they're talking about here. Because it says, no man can sacrifice himself for somebody else. Well, one of the things that the Maya kings and queens would do is an auto-sacrifice of their own blood, where their blood would be an offering to the gods, and that would allow the world to continue. So it wasn't just tear out your enemy's heart. It was, you got to give up some of your own blood. Now, as a picture, I could have shown you the one for the kings. I elected not to do that because they ran spines through their penis and bled. Didn't want a picture of that. Instead, you get the one that the queen did. Here is a picture of a queen. So we have this wonderful queen, and this is blown up so you don't see the whole thing. But I want you to concentrate on her hand and the fact that here is a rope. And then what you see on the rope are these spines that are woven into the rope. And because we kind of know what she's doing, we know why this is near her mouth. She is pulling through her tongue a rope with spines on it, which would probably bleed. And then they would bleed onto paper and they would burn the paper, and that would go to the gods. Now, if you know that that's the cultural background against which Alma is preaching, now you know why he not only says once that it's not a sacrifice of man, but twice it's not a human sacrifice. It's not the sacrifice that the king does. It's not the sacrifice that the queen does. It's not a human sacrifice where they take your heart. None of those things do what Christ will do. And in that context, now, just like we did with the New Testament and the lamp and the eye and turn the other cheek, we've got a richer context in which we can understand what's going on and why Alma preached the sermon using the words that he did. All right, two of them. One is the dog. If you have seen the dog, you should not be able to unsee the dog. If you have not seen the one on the right before, the very first thing that you see is just somebody's garage and then the shadow of a tree on the garage. That's what you should see at the beginning. Now look. The more you look at it, you should find, and it's real easy to do it because humans are programmed to see faces. We have probably a man. That big cleft chin here is probably male. We've got an eye and the nose and the mouth, and then the chin down here. I guess that's not a cleft chin, but still, you see the face. Once you have seen these illusions, you might miss it the first time by, but once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And I propose to you that that's exactly what happens when we take the Book of Mormon. We understand that it is an ancient text and that there's a lot that it isn't telling us. And then we put it into a place and at the appropriate time period where we say, what does that teach us? Number one, does it fit in time and place? Do the movements through time and space fit? And one of the reasons why when Steve and I were talking about this particular tour, I really like this one because in general, we're following the Nephites. We start where the Nephites start and we end up in central Mexico, but if Teotihuacan is part of the end, we've got that movement. And it's not perfect, but that general idea is there where we're beginning at the beginning and watching things as they grow. And once you see that location, then you can start putting more of the puzzle pieces together. The more that you see, the easier it is to recognize the dog, the easier it is to recognize the face on the wall, the easier it is to see how all of these pieces place the Book of Mormon in a very specific time frame and a very specific place. Thank you. See you on tour.